Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a name that echoes across the stars, a name spoken in terrified whispers aboard Imperial warships and bellowed with savage glee across the smoke-choked battlefields of 1,000 conquered worlds. It is a name that carries with it the promise of destruction on a scale most species cannot comprehend, a name that has become synonymous with the raw, unstoppable fury of an entire race bent on one singular purpose. That name is Ghazghkull mag Uruk Thraka, and this is his story. Now before we begin, let me set the scene for you, because understanding Ghazghkull means understanding something fundamental about the universe he inhabits, about the galaxy of the 41st millennium, and the creatures who call it home. In the far future, there is only war. You have heard that phrase before, probably more times than you can count, and yet it barely scratches the surface of what existence looks like in this era of endless conflict. Humanity clings to survival across 1,000,000 worlds, ruled by a decaying Imperium that worships a half-dead god strapped to a golden throne. Eldar ghosts wander the webway, mourning the civilization they destroyed with their own excess. The forces of chaos gnaw at the fabric of reality itself, whispering promises of power to anyone foolish enough to listen. And then there are the orcs. Ah, the orcs. They are something else entirely, aren't they? At first glance, they seem almost comical. Us green-skinned brutes with terrible grammar and a fondness for loud explosions. They build vehicles out of scrap metal and good intentions. Their doctors are more likely to kill you than cure you. Their technology shouldn't work by any rational standard, and yet it does, because the orcs believe it will, and in this universe, belief has a funny way of becoming reality. But make no mistake, beneath that comedic exterior lies something genuinely terrifying. The orcs are the most numerous species in the galaxy. They reproduce through spores, meaning that once they infest a world, they are nearly impossible to fully eradicate. They are biologically engineered for war, created eons ago by the ancient race known as the Old Ones, as living weapons in a conflict so old that even the stars have forgotten it. Every cell in an orc's body is designed for combat. They heal from wounds that would kill a human 3 times over. Yet they grow larger and more powerful the more they fight. And they want nothing in the entire universe more than they want a good scrap. Most orc invasions follow a predictable pattern. A warlord rises, beats enough heads together to gather a following, and then launches what the greenskins call a Great Green Crusade, though we'll just call it a massive warpath for simplicity. They crash into a sector of space, smash everything in sight, have a wonderful time doing it, and then inevitably fall apart as the warlord gets killed, or the various clans start fighting each other over who gets the best loot. It has happened countless times throughout history. The Imperium has learned to deal with these green tides, not easily, not without tremendous cost, but with a grim sort of routine. Mobilize the guard, call in the space marines, burn the spores, rebuild what you can, move on. But every now and then something different happens. Every now and then, an orc comes along who breaks the pattern. An orc who does not just fight for the joy of fighting, but who sees something beyond the next battle, beyond the next world, beyond the next skull to crack. An orc with vision, an orc with purpose, an orc who claims to speak with the voices of gods. Ghazghkull mag Uruk. Thraka is that orc. He is the self-proclaimed prophet of the orc gods, Gork and Mork, the beast of Armageddon, the warlord of warlords, and the single most dangerous greenskin alive in the 41st millennium. His campaigns have shattered entire sectors. His name is spoken with dread in languages across the galaxy. He has fought the Imperium's greatest heroes to a standstill, been killed and come back from the dead, and is currently leading the largest Green Crusade in 8,000 years, and a force of over 5 million warships, carrying billions upon billions of orc warriors toward a destiny that could reshape the entire galaxy. And the most remarkable thing about Ghazghkull, he started as nobody. Just another orc boy on a backwater world, indistinguishable from the countless billions of his kind who live and die in obscurity. His rise from that anonymity to galactic significance is one of the most fascinating stories in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. And tonight, we are going to tell it from beginning to end, in all its brutal, savage, and strangely compelling detail. So settle in, get comfortable. Let the ambient sounds wash over you as we journey into the heart of the Green Tide. Because the story of Ghazghkull mag Uruk Thraka is not just the story of one orc. It is the story of what happens when an entire race finds its messiah, and when the galaxy discovers that the one thing more terrifying than an orc horde without direction is an orc horde with a prophet leading the way. To understand the magnitude of that claim, we need to talk about the orc species for a moment longer, because their biology is the foundation upon which Ghazghkull's entire empire is built. Orcs are not born in the conventional sense. They reproduce through spores, the microscopic fungal organisms that are released constantly from living orcs and in tremendous quantities from dead ones. These spores settle into the soil of whatever world the orcs happen to be infesting and begin a growth cycle that produces the entire orcoid ecosystem. First come the squigs, simple fungal organisms that serve as everything from food to pets to living weapons. Then come the snotlings, tiny, dim-witted creatures that tend the underground fungal gardens. Then the Gretchen, small and cunning greenskins that serve as servants, labourers, and cannon fodder for their larger cousins. And finally, the orcs themselves, fully formed warriors who emerge from the ground with an instinctive understanding of violence and an immediate desire to use it. This means that orcs are, in a very real sense, a self-sustaining plague. Once they take root on a world, they are nearly impossible to fully eradicate, because the spores burrow deep into the soil and can remain dormant for centuries, waiting for conditions to improve before beginning the growth cycle anew. It also means that orc populations can recover from catastrophic losses with a speed that would be impossible for any conventionally reproducing species. Lose 90% of an orc army, and within a few years the spores of the fallen will have produced a new generation of warriors, ready to pick up where the last ones left off. The other critical feature of orc biology is their relationship with size and power. Orcs grow physically larger the more they fight and the more they win. A successful war boss is literally physically bigger than his subordinates, and the biggest orc in any group is, by definition, the boss. This creates a natural hierarchy based entirely on strength and victory, a meritocracy of violence where the most powerful individual rises to the top simply by being the most powerful. As it is elegant in its brutality, and it means that an orc leader who has been fighting and winning for decades can grow to truly monstrous proportions, towering over even space marines in their power armor. All of this matters because it provides the context for what Ghazghkull would eventually become. He did not build his empire through politics or diplomacy or inherited authority. He built it the orc way, through victory after victory after victory, each one making him bigger, stronger, and more impossible to resist. By the time he reached the heights of his power, Ghazghkull was a physical titan, a creature whose sheer size and strength were visible proof of the divine favor he claimed to possess. When an orc that big and that battle-scarred tells you that the gods have spoken to him, you tend to believe it. Or at least you tend not to argue, which for an orc amounts to the same thing. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us begin where all great stories begin. At the very bottom, on a world called Urk, beneath the dying sun, where a nameless orc boy was about to have the worst day of his life, and the galaxy was about to have the worst millennium of its existence. The planet Urk was not a remarkable world by any standard, not by the vast and terrible standards of a galaxy that contained hive worlds stacked with billions of souls, forge worlds where entire continents were given over to industrial production, and death worlds where the very air could strip flesh from bone. Urk was simply an orc world, one of countless such places scattered across the galaxy where the greenskins had taken root and established their violent, chaotic societies. The surface was a mess of crude settlements, scrap-built fortifications, and fighting pits, where rival clans tested their strength against one another in an endless cycle of petty warfare. It was, in other words, a perfectly normal orc planet. The kind of place that the Imperium noted on its star charts occasionally sent a punitive expedition to knock back the growing numbers, and otherwise tried not to think about too hard. Among the squabbling clans and warring tribes of Urk, there were all the usual suspects. The various orc clans, each with their own particular brand of violence and obsession. But the dominant culture on Urk, as it was on many orc worlds, was that of the Goths. Of the Goths are the orcs distilled to their most essential form. While other clans might get distracted by flashy technology or clever tricks, or the accumulation of shiny loot, the Goths care about one thing above all else, and that is fighting. They dress in black, they favor close combat, and they have an almost philosophical commitment to the idea that the best way to solve any problem is to hit it very hard with something heavy. They are, in the most literal sense imaginable, the orcs. And it was among these Goth warriors, in the dusty scrap heaps and fighting pits of Urk, that a certain orc boy lived his early life. We don't know what he was called before he became Ghazghkull, because orcs don't keep records, and the greenskins who knew him before his transformation are either dead or wouldn't remember anyway. What we do know is that he was unremarkable, just another green-skinned warrior in an ocean of green-skinned warriors, and fighting and scrapping and doing all the things that orc boys do to pass the time on a world where violence is both currency and entertainment. But then the Space Marines came. Approximately 9 years before what the Imperium would later call the Second War for Armageddon, a Space Marine strike force from an unknown chapter launched a raid against Urk. These punitive actions were standard practice for the Imperium. Quick, the targeted strikes designed to cull orc numbers and prevent any one world from building up enough greenskins to threaten nearby human colonies. The Marines hit the planet hard and fast, their bolters cutting through the orc defenders with the practiced efficiency for which the Adeptus Astartes are renowned. And during this battle, during the chaos and carnage and the thundering impacts of mass reactive bolter rounds, a single shell found its way into the skull of an anonymous Goth boy. There is some suggestion, based on later analysis of the event and the chapter that may have been involved, that it could have been a Dark Angel's bolt round that did the deed, though this has never been confirmed. What we know with certainty is that the round was devastating. It destroyed roughly 30% of the orc's cranium and pulped a significant portion of his brain. For any other creature in the galaxy, that would have been the end of the story. A footnote in a battle report that no one would ever read. One more greenskin casualty among thousands. But orcs are not any other creature. Their biology is astonishingly resilient, capable of surviving injuries that would be instantly fatal to humans. And this particular orc, this anonymous Goth boy, was tougher than most. He survived the initial wound, though just barely. His squad mates found him staggering through the aftermath of the battle, literally holding his damaged brain in place with both hands. They did what orcs do with badly wounded comrades who are still somehow walking and talking. They took him to a doctor. Or rather, they took him to the closest thing to a doctor that orc society produces. They took him to a pain boy. Specifically, they took him to the settlement of Rustspike, a grimy outpost operated by the Deathskulls clan. And there they traded the wounded Goth to a particularly notorious pain boy for the sum of 3 teeth and a new chopper. Because that is how orc medicine works. And the pain boy who received this barely alive patient, this collection of green flesh and exposed brain matter, was a figure who would become nearly as infamous as Ghazghkull himself. His name was Grotznik, Mad Doc Grotznik. Now we need to pause here and talk about Mad Doc Grotznik. Yes, because understanding him is essential to understanding what happened next. Pain boys occupy a strange and often terrifying niche in orc society. They are the green-skinned surgeons, they're doctors, they're biomechanical engineers. They possess an instinctive, genetically encoded understanding of biology and crude cybernetics that allows them to perform medical procedures that would make an Imperial chirurgeon faint. The catch is that pain boys are, almost without exception, completely and utterly insane. They experiment on their patients constantly, often performing entirely unnecessary procedures just to see what happens. They replace perfectly good limbs with mechanical substitutes because they think it looks better. They transplant organs between patients on a whim. And they do all of this without anything that a human would recognize as proper anesthesia, because in orc medicine, if the patient is screaming, that means he's alive. And if he's alive, and you haven't finished yet, even by these alarming standards, Ghazghkull was considered unhinged. He was a Deathskull's pain boy, which meant he combined the Deathskull's legendary kleptomania with a pain boy's obsession with surgery, resulting in a creature who would steal your organs and then try to improve them before putting them back. He had already developed a reputation on Urk as someone you went to only when no other option existed, by when the wound was so catastrophic that even orc resilience couldn't handle it without intervention. And the goth boy they brought him that day, the one with the ruined skull and the exposed brain, was exactly the kind of catastrophic case that made Ghazghkull's eyes light up with manic enthusiasm. Here was an opportunity to try something new, something ambitious, something that would push the boundaries of what orc surgery could achieve. Ghazghkull got to work immediately. Several hours later, as the nameless goth boy walked out of Ghazghkull's operating tent with a skull reinforced by plates of adamantium, the same virtually indestructible metal used in Space Marine power armor and the hulls of Imperial warships. Ghazghkull had replaced the destroyed portions of the orc's cranium with a bionic device made from the material, holding it all together with rivets, wires, and squig sinew. It was brutal work, crude by any standard except an orc's, but it was effective. The patient was alive. His brain was protected. And something fundamental had changed. There is debate among Imperial scholars about exactly what happened during that surgery. Some believe that Ghazghkull's implant triggered latent psychic abilities that had been dormant in the orc's brain, unlocking a connection to the collective psychic field that all greenskins generate, but few can consciously access. Others suggest that the trauma of the injury and the subsequent surgery simply drove the patient mad, and that his subsequent claims of divine communication were nothing more than the delusions of a brain-damaged berserker. The truth, as it so often does in the 41st millennium, probably lies somewhere in between, and it may be more complex than either explanation suggests. What is beyond dispute is what happened next. Within days of emerging from Ghazghkull's crude operating theater, the orc, who had been an anonymous nobody, began to change. He claimed to be receiving visions, not the vague, half-formed impressions that orc weird boys sometimes experience, but clear, purposeful communications from the twin gods of the orc race, Gork and Mork themselves. He said the gods had spoken to him, had shown him a vision of the future that burned with green fire. A galaxy engulfed in war on a scale that the universe had never seen. A tide of green sweeping across the stars, crushing everything in its path. Every orc in the galaxy united under a single banner, fighting a battle that would never end, a war so magnificent and so total that Gork and Mork themselves would tear their way out of the Imperium to join the fight. And he said the gods had chosen him to make it happen. Now, you might expect the other orcs on Urk to laugh at these claims. Orcs are not, generally speaking, a particularly religious species. They believe in Gork and Mork the same way they believe in gravity. It's there, it works. No need to think about it too hard. The idea of a prophet, of a chosen one receiving divine messages, is not really part of standard orc culture. But there was something about this particular orc that made other greenskins pay attention. Maybe it was the shiny adamantium skull, which was certainly impressive by orc standards. Maybe it was the new intensity in his eyes, one of which had been replaced with a bionic implant that glowed with an unsettling light. Or maybe, just maybe, there really was something divine at work, as some genuine connection to the twin gods of the greenskin race that gave his words a weight and authority that transcended normal orc social dynamics. Whatever the reason, orcs started listening. And when orcs start listening, they start following. And when they start following, things get very dangerous, very quickly. The orc, who would become known as Ghazghkull, began his ascent with the directness that characterized everything he would do for the rest of his existence. He walked out of Grotznik's tent, still rubbing his new adamantium skull plate, and immediately ran into the local Deathskull's warlord, a boss called Dregmek. Now, Dregmek was the big boss of Rustspike, and he didn't appreciate a goth wandering around his settlement like he owned the place. He confronted the newly augmented orc, his entourage of knobs grinning behind him in anticipation of a bit of sport at the stranger's expense. Dregmek opened fire with his custom weapon, every barrel blazing, filling the air with projectiles, and Ghazghkull walked right through it. The rounds sparked off his new adamantium skull plate. They punched into his body, and he barely flinched. He closed the distance and brought his iron-shod fist down on Dregmek's skull with enough force to end the confrontation permanently. Just like that, the Deathskull's boss was dead, and the scarred, as adamantium-plated goth was standing over his body with a look in his eyes that told everyone watching exactly what was about to change. Within 6 years of that surgery, this orc, now calling himself Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, a name that roughly translates in Low Gothic to something like Metal Skull Great Orc Ruler, had risen to become the supreme war boss of his tribe, and then the supreme war boss of the neighboring tribes, and then the supreme war boss of Urk itself. His rise was described by Imperial observers as meteoric, and it was fueled not just by his formidable personal strength and the intimidating gleam of his adamantium skull, but by something the orcs had never really experienced before. A message, a vision, a purpose. Ghazghkull didn't just tell the orcs of Urk that he was going to lead them to a good fight. Every war boss promised that. What he told them was that they had a destiny, in that they had been made for something greater than squabbling over scraps on a backwater world. That somewhere out among the stars, there was a war waiting for them that would put every fight they had ever known to shame. And that he, Ghazghkull, chosen prophet of Gork and Mork, was going to lead them there. During this time, Ghazghkull also acquired something else that would become an iconic part of his legend. Shortly after his surgery and his first visions, a tiny grot, as a member of the diminutive slave race that serves the orcs, was brought before the newly risen war boss. This particular grot was unremarkable in every way except one. Ghazghkull looked at him and saw something. Maybe it was a sign from the gods. Maybe it was a flash of prophetic insight. Maybe it was just a random impulse in a brain that was still adjusting to its new adamantium housing. Whatever it was, Ghazghkull claimed this grot for his own, burned his mark into the creature's flesh, and gave him a name, Makari. From that moment on, Makari would serve as Ghazghkull's personal banner-bearer, carrying what the orcs call the lucky stick at the front of every warpath, every charge, every battle. The banner itself was created in those early days, when Ghazghkull commanded Makari to record his vision using the war boss's own blood, the grot's finger, and a sheet of scrap metal. The result, scrawled in crude orc glyphs, was a record of the prophet's first revelation, a prophecy of the Great Green sweeping across the stars. It would become one of the most iconic symbols in orc culture, and Ghazghkull did something else remarkable for a grot's master. He gave Makari a gift, a necklace made from the fragments of the bolt shell that had pierced his brain and set this entire chain of events in motion. It was an extraordinary act of generosity by orc standards, where most bosses would sooner eat a grot than give one a present. And it spoke to something unusual about Ghazghkull, something that set him apart from every other war boss who had ever risen to power through brute strength alone. He had the capacity for loyalty, for connection, for something that, if you squinted hard enough, might almost look like sentiment. But Ghazghkull's rise on Urk was about to be accelerated by forces far beyond even his control. The star that Urk orbited, the sun that had warmed the planet for billions of years, began to die, and severe solar flares started bombarding the surface, causing radiation levels to spike to lethal extremes. Orcs are tough, but even greenskin biology has its limits. and the death toll began to mount. The world that had served as Ghazghkull's springboard was becoming uninhabitable. For most Orc war bosses, this would have been a catastrophe. For Ghazghkull, it was a gift from the gods. Because at almost the exact moment that Urk's sun began its death throes, something appeared in orbit around the planet. Something massive, something ancient, something that represented a ticket off this doomed rock and toward the destiny the gods had promised. A space hulk. For those unfamiliar with the concept, a space hulk is one of the most terrifying phenomena in the void between stars. It is a massive conglomeration of ships, asteroids, and debris that has been fused together over millennia by the chaotic energies of the warp, the dimension of psychic energy that underlies normal reality. Some are the size of small moons. They drift through the warp like continent-sized tumors, periodically emerging into real space before being pulled back in. They can contain anything. Ancient human technology from before the Age of Strife, alien artifacts of unknown origin, entire ecosystems of mutated creatures that have evolved in the dark spaces between fused hulls. They are treasure troves and death traps in equal measure. And when one appears in orbit around an inhabited world, it is never a good sign, unless you are an Orc. Because to an Orc, a space hulk is the single greatest prize imaginable. It is a ready-made warship, a mobile fortress, a traveling junkyard filled with salvageable technology and mysterious machinery. And it is exactly what you need if you want to take your warpath off-world and go looking for bigger fights among the stars. Ghazghkull seized the opportunity with both hands. He stood before the assembled clans of Urk, beneath a sky burning with solar flares, and proclaimed that this was a sign from Gork and Mork. The dying sun was not a punishment, but a message. It was the gods telling them that their time on Urk was over, that greater things awaited them among the stars, and that the space hulk was their chariot of war, sent by divine providence to carry them to their destiny. He gave the Orcs of Urk a choice: follow him or die. It wasn't much of a choice, really, and not when the alternative was being cooked alive by a dying star. But Ghazghkull delivered it with such conviction, such absolute certainty in the rightness of his vision, that the Orcs of Urk didn't just agree to follow him out of desperation. They followed him with enthusiasm, with passion, with something that, in a greenskin, passed for genuine belief. They followed him to an Orc, as the saying goes. Every clan, every tribe, and every warband on the planet united under Ghazghkull's banner and boarded the Space Hulk, which the warboss promptly renamed World Killer. It was the beginning of the Great Green Crusade that would eventually shake the galaxy to its foundations, though at this point it was still just a collection of fractious, excited greenskins crammed into a derelict hulk drifting through the void. A humble beginning for what would become the most devastating Orc warpath in 8,000 years. And the journey through the warp was not a pleasant one. Then again, journeys through the warp rarely are, even for species that have dedicated millennia to mastering its currents and eddies. For the Orcs, crammed aboard a space hulk with failing power systems and no Geller field to speak of, it was a particularly wild ride. The power systems on World Killer failed multiple times during the transit, causing the thin barrier between real space and the warp to collapse. When that happens, jump things from the other side get in. Demons poured through the breaches, creatures of nightmare and malice given temporary form by the raw psychic energy of the Imperium. For most species, this would have been a death sentence. Demonic incursion aboard a void ship is one of the most feared scenarios in all of Imperial doctrine, and entire fleets have been lost to the horrors that emerge when the warp bleeds into reality. But the Orcs had the time of their lives. Why, here were new things to fight, strange and challenging enemies that didn't die like regular opponents, that shifted and changed and came back for more. The Orcs threw themselves into these battles with delirious joy, and the constant combat kept them sharp, experienced, and most importantly, too busy fighting demons to start fighting each other. Ghazghkull himself dealt with the most dangerous of these incursions personally. At the heart of the Space Hulk, as in a chamber warped and twisted by the energies of the Imperium, the prophet of Gork and Mork came face to face with a bloodthirster of Horn, one of the most powerful demonic entities that exists. These are greater demons, manifestations of the blood god's rage given terrible form, and they are capable of destroying entire companies of space marines single-handedly. Ghazghkull fought the creature, bested it, and hurled it back through the warp rift before headbutting the breach itself closed. Let that image settle for a moment. The Orc prophet, skull gleaming with adamantium plating, headbutting a hole in reality shut after punching a greater demon of Khorne back through it. It is, in many ways, the most perfectly orky moment in the entire history of the species. While on World Killer, the Orcs did what Orcs always do when they have access to new machinery and unfamiliar technology. They explored, but they looted. They fought over the best bits. The Death Skulls, naturally, were in their element, stripping everything that wasn't nailed down and then bringing in burner boys with cutting torches to deal with the things that were. The mech boys began tinkering with the ancient machines they found, repurposing alien technology and arcane human devices into crude but effective Orc contraptions. On Ghazghkull's orders, many of his best mechs began working on a massive force field projector, or on a device that would prove crucial in the battles to come. Meanwhile, on the Space Hulk, competing warbands fought over salvage rights and scraps of territory. Minor wars broke out between rival clans, fueled by the usual Orc disagreements over who owned what and whose boss was the biggest. In any other warpath, this internal strife might have torn the Enterprise apart before it even reached its destination. But Ghazghkull possessed something that other war bosses lacked. He understood, was on some instinctive or perhaps divinely inspired level, that a certain amount of internal conflict was not just inevitable but desirable. It kept the Orcs sharp. It kept them fighting fit. And it burned off the aggressive energy that might otherwise have been directed at him. And then, with gut-wrenching suddenness, World Killer ripped back into real space. What had been the swirling madness of the warp was suddenly replaced by the cold clarity of the void, and there, hanging in the blackness before them, was their target, the Armageddon system. A cluster of Imperial worlds centered around a hive planet of immense strategic and industrial importance. One of the most valuable worlds in the Segmentum Solar, second in significance only to a handful of other planets in the entire Imperium. The Orcs had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Space Hulk, designated Alveus Alpha Alpha Sextus by Imperial administrators who had no idea what was about to hit them, tore through the outer defenses of the Armageddon system like a fist through wet paper. The system's defense network was outdated, consisting of obsolete orbital satellites and small attack craft that were simply not equipped to deal with a mobile fortress the size of a small moon. Desperate messages were sent across the void to pleas for assistance that would take weeks or months to reach the nearest Imperial reinforcements. 3 Space Marine chapters began to organize response forces, but they were too far away to arrive before the Orcs made planetfall. 1 month after the Space Hulk appeared in the Armageddon system, the Orcs disembarked. The date was the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, 941 of the 41st Millennium. It was the beginning of the Second War for Armageddon, and it would make legends of both the invader and the man who would become his greatest enemy. Armageddon was a hive world, one of the great industrial centers of the Imperium. Its surface was covered in massive hive cities, towering arcologies that housed billions of human souls and churned out the weapons and equipment that kept the Imperial war machine running. The planet had been an industrial powerhouse for millennia, and its resources considered so vital that its loss would have consequences far beyond the Armageddon sector itself. Thousands of worlds depended on the output of Armageddon's forges, and the Imperium would fight to the last man to defend it. Unfortunately, the man in charge of that defense was spectacularly bad at his job. Overlord Hermann von Strab, the planetary governor of Armageddon, was a study in incompetence raised to the level of art, arrogant, short-sighted, and criminally negligent. Von Straub had done virtually nothing to prepare the planet for the Orc invasion that Imperial intelligence had been warning about for months. His defensive strategy, such as it was, consisted of piecemeal deployments that scattered the planet's military forces in the worst possible configurations, denying them the concentration of force needed to resist the coming green tide. When the Orcs landed, they landed hard. Ghazghkull's forces hit the planet in a series of massive drops, with crude landing craft and repurposed debris falling from orbit like a rain of iron and violence. The greenskins poured across Armageddon's surface with the fury of a breaking dam, overwhelming outlying settlements and engulfing outlying hive cities with terrifying speed. Von Straub's scattered defenders were unable to mount a coordinated resistance, and within days, the Orcs had established a firm foothold on the planet. But amid the disaster of von Straub's mismanagement, a hero emerged. Not from the ranks of the Space Marines or the highest echelons of Imperial command, but from the most unlikely of places. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick was an officer of the Officio Prefectus, the branch of the Imperial military responsible for maintaining morale and discipline among the Astra Militarum. He was attached to the Armageddon Steel Legion, the planet's native Imperial Guard regiment, and he had been warning von Straub about the inadequacy of the planet's defenses for months. But his reward for this foresight was exile. Von Straub, furious at being questioned by a subordinate, banished Yarrick to Hive Hades, one of the planet's secondary hive cities, essentially sending him as far from the center of command as possible. This turned out to be the single most consequential mistake von Straub ever made, which is saying something for a man whose career was defined by consequential mistakes. Because Yarrick, far from being sidelined by his exile, used his position in Hive Hades to organize a defense that would change the entire course of the war. When Ghazghkull's forces reached Hive Hades, they expected another easy victory. What they found instead was a fortress. Yarrick had transformed the Hive City into a killing ground, organizing its civilian population into militia units, fortifying every approach, and preparing overlapping fields of fire that turned every street and corridor into a death trap. The Orcs attacked, and for the first time in the invasion, they were thrown back. They attacked again, and were thrown back again, and again, and again.
Honestly, this is the part of Ghazghkull's story that hooked me when I first got into the lore years ago. The idea that an orc, a species we mostly think of as comic relief, could lose a war and then actually sit down and figure out why he lost, that blew my mind. Most 40k villains just come back angrier. Ghazghkull came back smarter, and I think that's what elevates him from just another big scary war boss to one of the best characters in the entire setting. He earns his threat level. Nothing about his rise feels handed to him. But anyways, that's just my opinion. Let's continue the video.
The defense of Hive Hades became a legendary chapter in the history of both the Imperium and the Orcs. Yarrick's forces held against assault after assault, bleeding the greenskins for every meter of ground. The old Commissar was everywhere, his power claw ripping through Orc attackers, his Bale Eye, a piece of salvaged Orc technology grafted to his own face, glaring with a light that the greenskins came to believe could kill with a look. He was relentless, tireless, and absolutely unbending in his determination to hold the line. And it drove Ghazghkull absolutely mad with frustration. The war boss had swept across world after world, had conquered everything that dared stand in his path, and now here was this one stubborn human in this one stubborn city refusing to die. It became personal. Ghazghkull began diverting more and more of his forces to Hive Hades, pulling them from other fronts to break this one infuriating resistance. He took personal command of the assault, determined to crush Yarrick and his defenders through sheer overwhelming force. This was exactly what Yarrick wanted. Every Orc warrior sent against Hive Hades was an Orc warrior not fighting on another front. Every day that the Hive held was another day for the rest of the planet's defenders to regroup and reorganize. Yarrick was using himself and his city as bait, drawing Ghazghkull's attention and forces into a grinding siege, while the broader strategic picture shifted against the orcs. The two eventually met in the heart of the battle, Ghazghkull and Yarrick, prophet and commissar, in a clash that would begin a rivalry spanning decades. Ghazghkull was a towering monster of green muscle and adamantium plate, and Yarrick was an aging human whose body was held together by cybernetics and pure stubborn fury. The fight left Yarrick nearly dead, broken and bleeding among the ruins of his beloved hive Hades, but the commissar had bought what he needed most: time, because salvation eventually came to Armageddon. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels Space Marine chapter arrived at the head of a relief force, and the legendary Space Marine took one look at the situation, stripped von Straub of command, had him placed under arrest, and took personal control of the defense. The Blood Angels, joined by elements of the Salamanders and Ultramarines chapters, launched a devastating counteroffensive that caught the orcs off balance, with the Space Marines hitting them from behind, while the battered but unbroken defenders of the hive cities pressed them from the front. As the greenskin advance finally stalled and then began to reverse, the fighting was apocalyptic. The battle to retake Hive Tartarus, one of the cities the orcs had captured, devolved into some of the bloodiest close-quarters combat in the history of the Imperium. Space Marine strike forces and Imperial Guard regiments fought room by room, corridor by corridor, until the orcs ran out of ammunition and were reduced to fighting with rocks and bare fists. Even then, they didn't stop. Because orcs never stop, not until every last one of them is dead or the enemy finally breaks. But this time, it was the Greenskins who broke first. Commander Dante himself attempted a daring gamble to end the war quickly, dropping behind enemy lines to assault Ghazghkull's headquarters directly. It was a bold move, the kind of decisive strike that Space Marine commanders are trained to execute, hitting the enemy's head while their body is engaged elsewhere. Unfortunately, Ghazghkull was touring the front lines at the time, and the assassination attempt missed its primary target. But it did cause tremendous damage to the orc command structure, disrupting communications and supply lines in ways that weakened the Greenskin offensive at a critical moment. The war dragged on for over 2 years in total. In the west, waves of orc reinforcements attempted to push back toward Tartarus and break the spine of Imperial resistance. The forces defending the western regions had been thinned to support the main counteroffensive, and they were overrun. Ghazghkull, very much alive despite reports of his death, led a desperate last push to conquer the planet, driving his forces across the Skeletus River in a final bid for total victory. For a time, it looked as though the orcs might actually succeed. The Imperial lines buckled. Defensive positions that had held for months finally cracked under the weight of the green assault. But the defenders held just long enough for reinforcements to arrive, and the orc advance was thrown back. There were other forces at play as well. A contingent of squat warriors, led by Inquisitor Horst, arrived from the north and added their formidable firepower to the defense. These reinforcements, combined with the continuing Space Marine operations and the tireless resistance of the Armageddon Steel Legion, finally tipped the balance decisively against the orcs. After years of fighting, the Greenskins were pushed back to their landing zones and beyond, forced to retreat to their ships and escape the system. Ghazghkull himself was reported killed during the fall of Tartarus, supposedly taking a bolter shell to the bionic portion of his brain, but his body was never recovered. And as the Imperium would learn to its cost, an orc that cannot be confirmed dead should never be considered defeated. The Second War for Armageddon ended in an Imperial victory, but it was a victory purchased at staggering cost. The planet was devastated. Hive cities lay in ruins. Millions of Imperial citizens were dead. The orcs had been driven off, but the spores they had released during the invasion had already begun to take root, guaranteeing that greenskin infestations would plague Armageddon for centuries to come. For the Imperium, Armageddon was a hard lesson in the price of complacency and the consequences of poor leadership. But for Ghazghkull, it was something else entirely. It was a school, because Ghazghkull, despite his defeat, had not been destroyed. He had escaped Armageddon aboard his space hulk, wounded and diminished, but very much alive. And unlike most orc war bosses, who would have simply licked their wounds and moved on to the next fight, Ghazghkull did something extraordinary. He learned. He reflected on the defeat at Armageddon, not with the rage and frustration of a typical orc, but with the cold, a calculating intelligence that set him apart from every other warlord who had ever led a Green Crusade. He analyzed what had gone wrong. He identified the mistakes he had made. And he began to plan. This was unprecedented. Orcs, as a species, do not revisit the past. They live in the moment for the moment, and the concept of strategic self-reflection is as alien to them as poetry or personal hygiene. But Ghazghkull was not a typical orc, whether through divine inspiration, in the psychic connection triggered by his adamantium implant, or simply the extraordinary neural pathways created by Grotznik's surgery. The prophet of Gork and Mork possessed a capacity for long-term strategic thinking that the Imperium found deeply unsettling when it eventually became apparent. Ghazghkull took his remaining forces and headed for the Golgotha system, a region of space that had been orc territory for ages. The world of Golgotha was resource-rich. It's the kind of place where a cunning war boss could rebuild his strength and forge a new war machine. And Ghazghkull set about doing exactly that. He began subjugating the local orc populations, using the same combination of brute force, prophetic charisma, and strategic acumen that had served him on Urk. At first, he beat down bosses one at a time, gaining new mobs through personal combat. But word travels fast when orcs get excited, and soon, whole tribes were seeking out this legendary war boss with the shining metal skull, the one who claimed to speak with the voices of gods. There was something else about Golgotha that made it significant. It was here that the relationship between Ghazghkull and Yarrick entered its next and most peculiar chapter. Commissar Yarrick, you see, had not forgotten about Ghazghkull. The old soldier, scarred and augmented beyond recognition by the battles he had survived, one had dedicated himself to hunting the orc warlord with an obsessive, monomaniacal focus. While the rest of the Imperium was content to declare the threat neutralized and move on, Yarrick knew better. He had looked into Ghazghkull's eyes during their confrontation at Hive Hades, and he had seen something there that most humans could not recognize in an alien face. He had seen intelligence, ambition, and patience. Yarrick tracked Ghazghkull to Golgotha and arrived at the head of an Imperial Guard strike force, determined to end the greenskin threat once and for all. But Ghazghkull was ready for him. The war boss had set an elaborate trap, something that again demonstrated the kind of strategic sophistication that orcs were not supposed to possess. He constructed a base that appeared to be his last defensive position, or sacrificed his remaining gargants in a diversionary maneuver designed to draw the Imperial forces into a full commitment, and then sprung his trap. A second force, hidden in vast underground cave complexes, emerged to catch the Imperial attackers between the hammer of the hidden army and the anvil of Ghazghkull's fortress, while his space hulk drove off the Imperial Navy ships in orbit. The Battle of Golgotha was a disaster for the Imperial forces. Yarrick's army was shattered, and the old commissar himself was captured, making a last stand at the wreck of his Baneblade super-heavy tank after it had deliberately rammed one of the orc gargants. Ghazghkull had his enemy at last, and he could have killed Yarrick at any moment. The orc warlord had won. His dominance was absolute. And then Ghazghkull did something that no one, human or orc, could have predicted. He let Yarrick go. After a few weeks of what the Imperial records diplomatically describe as captivity, but which was probably closer to torture, Ghazghkull ordered Yarrick released. He provided the old commissar with a shuttlecraft and let him fly away. The reason, as far as anyone can determine, was simultaneously the most orky and the most terrifyingly intelligent thing Ghazghkull had ever done. He released Yarrick because the commissar was, in Ghazghkull's own words, too much fun to waste. The war boss was already planning his next great campaign, and he wanted Yarrick alive and angry for when it happened. He wanted the rivalry to continue. He wanted the challenge. There's something remarkable buried in that decision, if you take the time to unearth it. Most orcs see enemies as obstacles to be overcome, threats to be eliminated, or at best, entertaining opponents to fight until one side stops moving. But Ghazghkull saw Yarrick as something more. That he saw the Commissar as an essential part of the story, as the adversary whose resistance gave meaning to the war. Without Yarrick, the conquest of Armageddon would have been too easy, and an easy fight was, to Ghazghkull's divinely inspired mind, no fight at all. The prophet of Gork and Mork needed his nemesis. The story demanded it. It was also, from a purely tactical standpoint, a masterstroke. Yarrick returned to Imperial space burning with renewed hatred for Ghazghkull, and he would spend the next several decades warning anyone who would listen that the Orc warlord was coming back, that he was planning something far larger than anything the Imperium had yet faced. These warnings were largely ignored by Imperial High Command, who had other crises to deal with and were inclined to view a single Orc warlord as a diminishing threat. But they ensured that when Ghazghkull did return, there would be at least one person on Armageddon who was ready for him. And Ghazghkull was planning something larger, much larger. In the years following the Battle of Golgotha, the warboss embarked on a series of campaigns across the galaxy that served as live-fire testing grounds for the tactics and technologies he intended to deploy in his return to Armageddon. In 962 of the 41st Millennium, he destroyed the world of Booker III, testing his force's ability to overwhelm a planet's defenses. A decade later, his forces overran the agricultural world of Chigon 17, defeating the Imperial Guard defenders in a guerrilla campaign that demonstrated a level of Orc tactical flexibility that Imperial observers found deeply alarming. In 982, he captured the Imperial battlecruiser Radiant Way in orbit around Chigon 17, and when relief forces arrived, they found that the Orcs had already vanished from the system. Ghazghkull was testing, probing, learning. Each engagement gave him new information about how the Imperium reacted to threats, what its vulnerabilities were, and where its defenses could be exploited. He also formed a crucial alliance during this period. Nazdreg Ug Erdgrub was a warboss of the Bad Moons clan, known throughout the Orc Empire for having the best mech boys in the galaxy. Nazdreg's mechs were particularly renowned for their mastery of teleportation technology, the ability to instantaneously transport objects and warriors across vast distances. This was technology that Ghazghkull coveted deeply, and he struck a deal with Nazdreg to obtain it. The two war bosses allied for an assault on the Imperial world of Piscina 4, where they faced the Dark Angel's Space Marine chapter in a brutal battle. In exchange for his help, Ghazghkull received the secrets of the teleportation devices, adding another devastating tool to his already formidable arsenal. It is worth noting that the assault on Piscina 4 brought Ghazghkull into conflict with the same Space Marine chapter that may have been responsible for the bolt round that shattered his skull on Urk all those years ago. Whether Ghazghkull was aware of this connection is unknown, but there is a certain poetic quality to it, a sense of the story coming full circle in a way that the Orc gods might have appreciated. 57 years. That is how long Ghazghkull waited between his first invasion of Armageddon and his return. 57 years of preparation, of planning, of building an invasion force that dwarfed anything the galaxy had seen in millennia. When Imperial intelligence officers later calculated the exact interval and realized that Ghazghkull had returned on precisely the same date as his first invasion, 57 years to the day, the implications sent shivers through the highest levels of Imperial command. This was not the behavior of a mindless savage. This was the behavior of a strategic genius with a flair for dramatic symbolism, and it terrified them. The Third War for Armageddon began in 998 of the 41st Millennium, on the day of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, the exact same holy day on which the first invasion had landed. Imperial monitoring stations detected a massive disturbance in the warp, and then the Orc fleet arrived. It was enormous beyond comprehension, on over 50 capital-class warships, more than 300 escort vessels, and at least 4 space hulks, each one a mobile fortress in its own right. The combined fleets of Ghazghkull and his allies constituted the largest armada ever to assault a single world of the Imperium, outnumbering the defending Imperial Navy 6-1. The Imperium had fortified Armageddon extensively in the decades since the Second War. New naval stations, orbital defense platforms, and ground-based weapon systems had been installed, giving the planet a level of protection surpassed only by Terra and a handful of other worlds. Against the force that Ghazghkull unleashed, none of it mattered. Kill cruisers made suicidal rushes against the Imperial blockade, sacrificing themselves to create gaps through which the main invasion force could pour. Monitor stations were overwhelmed and destroyed, and worse still, as intelligence reports indicated that 3 more massive Orc fleets were inbound. The defenses that had been designed to stop any conceivable threat were simply not enough. Commissar Yarrick was there, of course. The old soldier had arrived on Armageddon 2 weeks before the invasion began, driving the planet's defenders into a frenzy of preparation with the same iron will that had held Hive Hades decades earlier. And he had forged the Planetary Defense Force and Armageddon's Imperial Guard regiments into what he called an unstoppable machine of iron and steel. And when Ghazghkull heard that his old nemesis was in the fight once more, the war boss reportedly redoubled his efforts. The two were drawn to each other like opposite poles of a magnet, each one simultaneously the other's greatest enemy and greatest motivation. The Third War for Armageddon was a conflict of staggering scale. Over 25 Space Marine chapters committed forces to the defense, including the Black Templars, the Salamanders, the Blood Angels, and the Space Wolves. Dozens of Astra Militarum regiments were deployed. Titan legions strode across the ash wastes of Armageddon, their massive god machines trading fire with Orc gargants in duels that shook the earth for kilometers around. The war raged across the entire planet, from the towering hive cities to the toxic wastelands between them, from the shores of the polluted oceans to the equatorial jungles where the fighting was at its most desperate and primal. Ghazghkull's forces initially conquered roughly half the planet's surface, their advance so swift and overwhelming that entire hive cities fell before their defenders could organize a coherent response. The teleportation technology that Ghazghkull had acquired from Nazdreg proved devastating, as allowing Orc strike forces to appear behind Imperial lines without warning and wreak havoc on supply depots, command posts, and artillery positions. For a time, it seemed as though Armageddon might actually fall. But the defenders held. Yarrick's leadership, combined with the superhuman capabilities of the Space Marine chapters and the sheer, grinding determination of the Astra Militarum, eventually stabilized the front lines and turned the Orc advance into a stalemate. But neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. The war settled into a brutal, grinding attritional conflict that consumed millions of lives and reduced entire regions of the planet to rubble and ash. The scope of the fighting defied easy description. In the equatorial jungles, Katahan devil regiments fought running battles against Orc commandos through undergrowth so dense that visibility dropped to mere meters. In the ash wastes between the hive cities, massive armored formations clashed in tank battles that stretched across horizons. Imperial Baneblades and Lehman Russ battle tanks trading fire with Orc battle wagons and looted vehicles in clouds of choking dust. In the hive cities themselves, the fighting was most terrible of all, with entire levels of these kilometer-high structures contested floor by floor, as the defenders using the industrial infrastructure as fortifications, while the Orcs used it as raw material for their ever-expanding arsenal. The war also saw one of the most disturbing developments in Armageddon's already troubled history. Hermann von Straub, the disgraced former planetary governor whose incompetence had nearly cost the planet during the Second War, resurfaced. The traitor had thrown in his lot with the Orcs, and it was revealed that he had collaborated with Ghazghkull to overthrow one of the hive cities, ruling it as his personal fiefdom under greenskin protection. The revelation was a stinging humiliation for the Imperium, and von Straub was eventually hunted down and killed by a unit of Penal Legion troopers, known as the Last Chancers, ending his miserable story in the only way it could have ended. The sheer scale of the war drew attention from beyond the material plane as well, and Armageddon had been the site of the first war for Armageddon centuries earlier, a conflict against the forces of chaos that had been covered up by the Inquisition. The psychic disturbance generated by the massive fighting during the Third War weakened the barriers between reality and the warp in the Armageddon system, and soon enough, chaos forces began to take an interest. Cornate demons, drawn by the unprecedented amount of blood being spilled, began manifesting on the planet's surface. As the Great Rift that would eventually tear the galaxy in two only made things worse, and Armageddon found itself caught in a three-way conflict between orcs, the Imperium, and the forces of the Blood God. Through it all, the rivalry between Ghazghkull and Yarrick continued to define the war. When Ghazghkull heard that his old enemy was on the planet, he reportedly responded with something that orc witnesses described as excitement, and a reaction that terrified Imperial intelligence analysts who intercepted the reports. The war boss was not just fighting a war, he was enjoying a rematch with the one opponent he considered worthy of his full attention. And here is where Ghazghkull did something that once again defied everything the Imperium thought it knew about orcs. He got bored. It is difficult to overstate how unusual this is. Orcs don't get bored of fighting. Fighting is the entire purpose of their existence. It's the thing they were literally created to do. An orc dropped into the middle of a massive grinding war should be the happiest creature in the galaxy. But Ghazghkull was not a typical orc. And the stalemate on Armageddon was not the kind of fighting that satisfied his prophetic vision. He had seen something greater, something that went beyond the conquest of a single world, no matter how important that world might be. His visions. The messages from Gork and Mork that had guided him since the surgery on Urk were becoming more frequent and more insistent. They were accompanied now by blinding headaches and crackling green lights, as if the gods themselves were shouting in his ear, demanding that he look beyond Armageddon to the larger destiny that awaited him. And so Ghazghkull retreated to his flagship, Kil Rekka, to think. He surrounded himself with a mob of warpheads, kept the orc psychers who served as conduits for the collective psychic energy of the greenskin race, hoping they could help him interpret his visions. And it was there, in the depths of his command ship, that revelation struck. Ghazghkull realized that no other orc shared his ambition. For every other greenskin in the galaxy, a good fight like Armageddon was enough. They were content with the war as it was, content to scrap and die and scrap again. But Ghazghkull could see beyond this to something greater. He could see a galaxy united in green fire, a war that would never end, a conflict so total and so magnificent that the very gods of the orc race would be drawn from the warp to join it. He could see what the greenskins called the Great Green Crusade, the final apocalyptic campaign that would prove the orcs' worth before the eyes of their divine patrons. And he understood, us with a clarity that cut through the headaches and the chaos, like a power claw through ceramite, that Armageddon was not the destination, it was just the beginning. Ghazghkull left Armageddon. He handed command of the ongoing war to his subordinate war bosses, took his inner circle, Makari at his side, and departed aboard Kil Rekka with a small fleet of warships. Behind him, the Third War for Armageddon continued, a grinding horror that would consume Armageddon for years to come. But Ghazghkull's eyes were already on the stars, looking toward the next stage of the plan that Gork and Mork had revealed to him. And Yarrick, as always, followed. The old commissar, now ancient beyond the normal span of human years, sustained by cybernetics and the sheer force of his hatred, set out in pursuit of Ghazghkull with every available warship. He was joined by High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templar's Space Marine chapter, who had brought an entire crusade to bear on the Orc menace. Together, they chased Ghazghkull across the void, determined to catch the war boss before he could build yet another army and launch yet another devastating invasion. They cornered him at a place called the Haunted Gulf, a region of space riddled with warp anomalies and gravitational distortions. It seemed as though Ghazghkull's luck had finally run out. The combined Imperial fleet had him trapped, and there was nowhere left to run. The battle that erupted in the Haunted Gulf was savage even by the standards of void warfare, with Orc warships trading broadsides with Imperial cruisers, while boarding actions raged across the hulls of both fleets. But in the midst of the chaos, at the very moment when defeat seemed certain, something happened. Ghazghkull's weird boys, the psychers who traveled with his fleet, suddenly fell into a collective trance. Green energy crackled through the bridge of Kilrekka, and through the roaring psychic static, Ghazghkull heard the voices of his gods more clearly than he ever had before. Gork and Mork spoke to their prophet, and their message was simple and devastating in its implications. It was not his time to die. The whole galaxy must echo with the battle cry of the Orc race. He was to gather a warpath unlike anything the universe had ever seen, and to do this, he must first defeat every other major Orc warlord in the galaxy and bring their forces under his command. Upon uniting the Orc race, he was to lead them in a battle that would last forever. Kilrekka vanished in a blaze of green energy, disappearing into the warp with a flash that left the Imperial pursuers staring at empty space. Helbrecht's crusade was back to square one. Yarrick's quarry had escaped once more. And Ghazghkull was on his way to fulfill the grandest and most terrifying prophecy in the history of the Orc race. Kilrekka reappeared in the Orc Empire of Octarius, a region of space that had been green-skin territory for thousands of years. Octarius was not the backwater that Urk had been. It was a thriving Orc empire with its own war bosses, its own territories, and its own internal politics, such as Orcs understand the concept. The most powerful figure in the region was a war boss named Urgok the Slayer, who styled himself the Overfiend of Octarius, and did not take kindly to outsiders, even outsiders, with shiny adamantium skulls and claims of divine mandate. Ghazghkull's arrival in Octarius kicked off a campaign of subjugation that demonstrated his approach to interspecies Orc diplomacy. He beat Urgok into submission, not through trickery or strategic maneuvering, but through the simple, time-honored Orc method of punching the other boss until the other boss stopped getting up. Most of Urgok's followers joined Ghazghkull willingly, recognizing the bigger, meaner, more divinely inspired boss when they saw one. Those too slow to figure out which way the wind was blowing were beaten into compliance. Within weeks, Ghazghkull had absorbed the entire Orc empire of Octarius into his growing force, and the news of his victory spread across the galaxy at the speed of Orc excitement. But Octarius presented another challenge beyond rival war bosses. The region had recently been invaded by Tyranids, the extragalactic horror organisms of Hive Fleet Leviathan, which had been drawn to Octarius by the concentration of biomass represented by the Orc population. The resulting conflict, known as the Octarius War, was one of the most nightmarish conflicts in the galaxy. A meat grinder, where two of the universe's most prolific and aggressive species fought each other in an escalating spiral of violence. The Orcs got bigger and tougher from the constant fighting, while the Tyranids adapted and evolved new bioforms to counter Orc tactics, and the whole thing just kept getting worse. Ghazghkull waded into this conflict with characteristic directness. His forces carved through the Tyranid swarms, the warboss himself leading from the front, as always. Kilrekka emerged from the warp directly into the war zone, deploying rocks, hollowed-out asteroids fitted with engines and weapons that served as Orc dropships, directly into the combat. The Orcs fought the Tyranids with savage enthusiasm, reveling in the challenge of an enemy that was as relentless and numerous as they were. And when the immediate threat was dealt with, Ghazghkull declared victory, scooped up the survivors, and headed off into the void to continue building his force. The Great Green Crusade was gaining momentum. Orcs from across the galaxy were being drawn to Ghazghkull's banner, pulled by the same instinctive psychic magnetism that drives greenskins to gather in ever larger numbers when something exciting is happening. The collective psychic field that all Orcs generate, the same field that makes their technology work and their gods real, was resonating with the energy of Ghazghkull's growing force. a wave of psychic excitement rippled through the warp, reaching orc populations hundreds of light years away and filling them with an irresistible urge to pick up their weapons and head toward the source of the disturbance. Weird boys and warp heads across the galaxy were having seizures, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of psychic energy being generated. Mad boys, orcs driven insane by their sensitivity to the psychic field, were experiencing visions of green fire and hearing drums that no one else could hear. Ghazghkull was becoming more than a war boss. He was becoming a gravitational center for the entire orc race, a focal point around which the greenskin species was beginning to coalesce in a way it had not done in over 8,000 years. Not since the era of the Beast, the legendary orc warlord who had nearly destroyed the Imperium in the 32nd Millennium, had any single orc commanded such a following or generated such a massive concentration of the collective psychic field. And then the reports started coming in from across the Imperium, and they made no sense at all. Imperial intelligence, specifically the analysts known as the Logis Strategos, began receiving conflicting information about Ghazghkull's location. He was documented as being within Octarius, but he was also reported sacking the world of Cantisa and fighting on the killing fields of Al-Rokhta and reappearing at Armageddon to give tactical advice to the war bosses he had left in charge. And raiding targets in the Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy cut off by the Great Rift, and fighting around Ryza, one of the Imperium's most important forge worlds, all simultaneously. This caused what Imperial records describe as consternation at the highest levels of the Imperium, which is bureaucratic language for everyone completely lost their minds. How could one orc be in 6 places at once? Some theorists suggested that the orcs were using warp storms to navigate the galaxy, appearing in multiple locations in rapid succession through the chaotic shortcuts that the Imperium provided. Others proposed that extreme temporal dilation within the warp was to blame, that Ghazghkull was experiencing time differently than the rest of the galaxy and was essentially living through years of campaigning in what appeared to external observers as simultaneous events. But the more unsettling possibility, one that no one in Imperial High Command wanted to seriously consider, was that Ghazghkull's connection to Gork and Mork had grown so powerful that he was beginning to transcend normal physical limitations, appearing wherever the Green Crusade needed him, through the sheer psychic power of the Orc god's favor. Whatever the explanation, the result was the same. Ghazghkull's Great Green Crusade was everywhere, and the Imperium could not pin it down. Over 5 million warships were now flying under his banner, the largest Orc fleet assembled in 8,000 years, and they were hitting targets across the galaxy in a pattern that seemed random but might, if you looked at it from the right angle, reveal the outlines of a strategy so vast and so complex that it encompassed the entire Milky Way. It was during this period of galactic upheaval that Ghazghkull's story took another dramatic turn, the Psychic Awakening, as a galaxy-wide event that saw psychic powers surging across all species, drew the prophet of Gork and Mork into conflict with a new enemy. The Space Wolves, one of the most fierce and aggressive Space Marine chapters, had been tracking the Green Crusade, and their wolf lord, Ragnar Blackmane, had become convinced that the key to stopping the Orc menace lay in killing Ghazghkull himself. Ragnar, a legendary warrior even by Space Marine standards, was drawn to the world of Krongar by mysterious visions that he believed were leading him to his destiny. Ghazghkull was there too, and he appeared to have been expecting the Space Wolf. The war boss deliberately engineered a confrontation, detonating explosives that sealed the entrance to an Imperial cathedral and trapped himself and Ragnar inside, away from their respective forces. It was to be a duel, one-on-one, the greatest Orc warlord against one of the Imperium's finest warriors. Then the battle between Ghazghkull and Ragnar Blackmane was a clash of titans that reportedly lasted for what some sources describe as an extended, grueling engagement. The two fought with everything they had, Ragnar's superhuman speed and skill against Ghazghkull's impossible strength and resilience. The Wolf Lord managed to slow the war boss by severing the hydraulic cabling in his mega armor, reducing the power available to Ghazghkull's mechanical systems. But it was not enough. Ghazghkull caught Ragnar in his massive power claw and crushed the Space Marine with enough force to shatter bones and rupture organs. But Ragnar, even as his body was being broken, found one last reserve of strength. With a final desperate swing of his Frostblade, the Wolflord severed Ghazghkull's head from his body. The Warboss's adamantium-plated skull, the same skull that had started this entire saga on the operating table of a mad painboy on Urk, tumbled to the ground. Ragnar lifted it high and howled in victory, and then collapsed. The injuries Ragnar had sustained were so severe that only the experimental Rubicon Primaris procedure, a dangerous process that either kills or transforms a Space Marine into a more powerful Primaris form, could save his life. As for Ghazghkull, in the moments between life and death, the Prophet reportedly lamented that his work was unfinished and that there was nobody left to bring back Makari now. It was a strangely touching sentiment from a creature that had spent centuries terrorizing the galaxy, and it suggested that even in his final moments, Ghazghkull's thoughts were not of conquest or glory, but of the small grot who had carried his banner and kept his secrets for so long. But the story of Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka does not end with a severed head on a cathedral floor, because orcs, as we have discussed, are extraordinarily hard to kill permanently. And Ghazghkull had something that no other orc in the galaxy possessed. He had Mad Doc Grotsnik. Almost immediately after Ghazghkull's death, the Great Green Crusade began to fall apart. Without the Prophet's unifying presence, the various warbosses and clans started reverting to their default state of fighting each other. It fell to an unlikely trio to save the day. Makari, Ghazghkull's tiny, eternally loyal banner-bearer. A knob called Bullets, one of Ghazghkull's most trusted lieutenants. And Grotsnik, the mad genius who had started everything with a bolt round and an adamantium skull plate all those decades ago. They recovered Ghazghkull's body and brought it to Grotsnik's laboratory, where the painboy did what he did best. He worked his madness. He dismembered the Prophet's remains and attached the various parts to a gigantic new suit of armor, far larger and more powerful than anything Ghazghkull had worn before. And he rigged up a power generator that existed in the strange space between the material universe and the warp, and he used it to channel a beam of crackling green lightning directly into the spot where Ghazghkull's broken form lay. The experiment had roughly a 4 in 5 chance of destroying half the planet. But Grotsnik, being Grotsnik, did it anyway. It worked. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka rose from the dead, and he was bigger, stronger, and more terrifying than he had ever been. His new body was enormous, towering over even the largest orcs, encased in mega armor that incorporated technologies looted from a dozen different species and enhanced by Grotsnik's unhinged genius. His weapons were upgraded too. His power claw, now dubbed Gork's Claw, could crush a tank like a tin can. His new ranged weapon, a massive 4-barreled cannon called Mork's Roar, was powered by Ghazghkull's own psychic connection to the orc gods, meaning it never truly ran out of ammunition, only needing to reload when Ghazghkull believed it should. Think about that for a moment. His gun only needs ammunition when he thinks it does. The weapon operates on faith. It is perhaps the most perfectly orky piece of equipment ever created, a gun that fires on the power of belief. His mega armor deserves special mention as well. Mega armor is the orc equivalent of Terminator plate, a suit of incredibly thick plating, usually made from scavenged tank armor, or worn over a powered exoskeleton that gives the wearer phenomenal strength and nearly unbreakable protection. The downside is that it is heavy and slow, but Ghazghkull's new suit incorporated mega boosters, power amplification devices that compensated for the weight and allowed him to move with a speed that his size should not have permitted. His jaw had been replaced with iron, his remaining biological eye augmented with a bionic replacement that could see across multiple spectrums, and on his famous adamantium skull plate, the very same plate that Grotsnik had riveted onto a dying goth boy on Urk all those years ago, had been reinforced and expanded to cover even more of his enormous cranium. And then there was his boss pole, the massive banner standard that rose from his back, topped with a huge horned skull, possibly from some beast Ghazghkull had slain during his many campaigns. The boss pole served a dual purpose, and both as a symbol of authority that increased the morale and fighting ferocity of nearby orcs, and as a way for his followers to easily identify their war boss in the chaos of battle. When you saw that skull standard rising above the smoke and fire, you knew that the prophet was there, and for the orcs, it meant that Gork and Mork were watching. For the Imperium, it meant that the worst was about to begin. The prophet had returned, and the galaxy trembled. Not everyone was happy about Ghazghkull's resurrection, of course. An ambitious orc commando named Def Colonel Zogbos had attempted to seize control of the Great Green Crusade while the prophet was down, and he stormed Grotznik's laboratory in a bid to kill both the pain boy and the patient before the resurrection could be completed. Zogbos managed to destroy much of Grotznik's equipment and nearly reached the Mad Doc himself, but he was too late. The resurrected Ghazghkull grabbed the Def Colonel's head and crushed it like an overripe fruit, reasserting his dominance in the most direct way possible. With his return, the Great Green Crusade roared back to life. The psychic energy generated by the resurrection sent shockwaves through the warp, and orcs across the galaxy felt the prophet's return in their bones. The migration began anew. Greenskins from every corner of the Milky Way, dropping whatever they were doing and heading toward the sound of the drums. The 5 million ships grew to more. The billions of warriors multiplied. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, the beast of Armageddon, the prophet of Gork and Mork, was alive, and his Great Green Crusade was just getting started. Now, we have spent a great deal of time tracing the events of Ghazghkull's life, the battles and the betrayals, the alliances and the escapes, the deaths and the resurrections. But to truly understand what Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka means, both within the lore of Warhammer 40,000 and as a character in the broader sense, we need to step back from the chronology and examine the deeper themes at work. Let us start with the most fundamental question. Is Ghazghkull really a prophet? Are the visions he claims to receive from Gork and Mork genuine? Or is he simply a brain-damaged orc whose delusions of grandeur happen to be backed up by sufficient strength and charisma to make them self-fulfilling? The answer, frustratingly and fascinatingly, is that it almost doesn't matter. In the universe of Warhammer 40,000, belief has power. Literal, measurable, reality-altering power. The Orc collective psychic field. The same Gestalt energy that makes red paint make vehicles go faster and yellow explosions hit harder because the Orcs believe these things to be true, is one of the most potent forces in the galaxy. When enough Orcs believe something, it becomes real. Their technology works not because of sound engineering principles, but because the greenskins who built it believe it should. That their gods exist in the warp, not because of ancient cosmic events, but because the Orc race believes in them with such total, unquestioning conviction that their psychic energy manifests Gork and Mork as real entities in the Imperium. And now consider what happens when billions upon billions of Orcs believe that one particular greenskin is the chosen prophet of those gods. Consider the sheer psychic weight of that collective belief focused on a single individual. Every Orc who follows Ghazghkull, every greenskin who chants his name before a charge, every boy who believes that the prophet speaks with the voices of Gork and Mork is adding their psychic energy to the field that surrounds him. They are literally making his prophecy true through the force of their belief. To put this in perspective, consider how the Orc psychic field works in practical terms. The old ones, the ancient race that created the Orcs eons ago as weapons in the war in heaven against the Necrons and the Star Gods, built the greenskin species with an innate, collaborative psychic ability. Unlike the flashy, individualistic psychers of the Eldar or humanity, who can summon storms of warp energy or peer into the future, Orc psychic power is distributed across the entire species. Each individual greenskin contributes a tiny amount of psychic energy to a collective field, and when enough Orcs gather in one place, that field becomes strong enough to alter reality itself. This is why Orc technology works. a bolted-together collection of scrap metal that should, by all laws of physics, fly apart the moment you pull the trigger, functions perfectly in an orc's hands, because the orc believes it will function. A vehicle painted red goes faster because the orcs believe red makes things go faster, and their collective psychic conviction makes it literally true. And this is not a metaphor. It is a measurable, documented phenomenon that Imperial scientists have studied and failed to fully explain. Orc weapons that are captured and tested by the Mechanicus frequently fail to operate at all, because without the psychic field of a believing orc to support them, they are exactly what they appear to be: random pieces of junk, held together with wire and optimism. Now extend that principle to a living being. Consider an orc who stands at the center of the largest gathering of greenskins in 8,000 years. An orc that billions of followers believe to be the chosen instrument of their gods. An orc whose every victory reinforces the collective belief that he is something more than mortal. The psychic field surrounding such an individual would be staggering. It would make him faster, tougher, stronger, luckier, and more formidable in ways that transcend normal biology. It might even grant him abilities that are genuinely supernatural. Psychic powers channeled not through his own mind, but through the belief of his entire race. This is what makes Ghazghkull so uniquely dangerous and so uniquely fascinating. He exists at the nexus of belief and reality, faith and power, prophecy and self-fulfillment. Whether Grotznik's surgery really did unlock a genuine connection to the orc gods, or whether Ghazghkull is simply the beneficiary of the most massive placebo effect in galactic history, the practical result is the same. He wields power that approaches the divine, not because he is divine, but because enough orcs believe he is, and in this universe, that amounts to the same thing. It is also worth considering the nature of Gork and Mork themselves in this context. Unlike the Chaos gods, who are entities of malice and corruption born from the negative emotions of sentient species, the Orc gods are straightforward reflections of the Orc psyche. Gork is brutal but cunning, the god who hits you hard when you are looking. Mork is cunning but brutal, the god who hits you when you are not. The distinction between them is so subtle that orcs have been known to wage wars over which is which is really just another excuse for the greenskins to do what they do best. But the gods are real, or at least as real as anything in the warp can be said to be real. Vulcan, the primarch of the Salamander's Space Marine Legion, personally witnessed Gork and Mork battling each other at the beginning of time during a vision he experienced while fighting the beast in the 32nd Millennium. The experience gave Vulcan an understanding of the fundamental nature of the orc race and its relationship to chaos, while revealing them as an emergent species that evolves through constant trial and error, their gods growing stronger with every battle fought and every skull cracked. If Gork and Mork are real, and if their power grows proportionally to the number of orcs fighting in the galaxy, then Ghazghkull's Great Green Crusade represents something far more significant than a simple military campaign. It represents an attempt to amplify the power of the orc gods to a level never before achieved, to generate enough collective psychic energy to literally tear the barrier between the material universe and the warp, allowing Gork and Mork to manifest in physical form and join the battle. The implications of two gods of pure violence and aggression walking the material realm, powered by the psychic energy of an entire species, are genuinely apocalyptic. And this leads us to perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Ghazghkull's character, as his vision for the orc race goes beyond anything that any greenskin has ever articulated. Most war bosses want to fight and win. Ghazghkull wants to fight forever. His ultimate goal is not the conquest of this world or that sector, not the defeat of this enemy or that rival, but the ignition of a war so total and so permanent that it encompasses the entire galaxy and never, ever ends. He wants to create a state of perpetual conflict in which the orcs can exist in their most natural and fulfilled state, fighting always, growing always, getting bigger and stronger and more numerous until the psychic energy they generate literally tears the boundary between the material universe and the warp, allowing Gork and Mork to manifest in physical form and join the battle themselves. This is what the orcs call the Great Green, yet the prophesied state in which the barrier between the orc gods and their followers dissolves entirely. It is simultaneously a religious concept, a military strategy, and an existential philosophy. Ghazghkull is not just trying to win a war, he is trying to transform the fundamental nature of the galaxy, to remake reality itself in the image of the orc gods. And the terrifying thing is that he might actually be able to do it. Consider the historical precedent. The last time an orc warlord of comparable power and ambition arose was during the War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium, roughly 6,000 years before Ghazghkull's time. The Beast, as that warlord was known, came closer to destroying the Imperium than any other threat in its history, besieging Terra itself and nearly toppling the very seat of human civilization. It took the combined efforts of multiple Space Marine chapters, the personal intervention of Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, and the sacrifice of an Imperial Fist successor chapter to stop the Beast, and even then, it was a near thing. The Beast had built attack moons, artificial planetoids capable of generating their own gravity fields, which he used as mobile battle stations to assault key Imperial worlds. His orcs were so numerous and so organized that they had established diplomatic embassies on Terra itself, delivering an ultimatum to the Imperium in fluent High Gothic. Let that sink in. Orcs speaking perfect High Gothic and engaging in diplomacy. It was a level of orc sophistication that the Imperium had never encountered before, and devoutly hoped never to encounter again. And yet Ghazghkull shows every sign of surpassing even the Beast. His fleet of over 5 million ships dwarfs any orc force assembled in recorded history. His strategic acumen is arguably superior, honed by decades of warfare against the best the Imperium has to offer. And unlike the Beast, who was ultimately hemmed in by the limitations of his era, Ghazghkull operates in a galaxy that has been torn in half by the Great Rift, where the Imperium is stretched thinner than it has ever been, fighting wars on every front against every conceivable enemy. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allows Imperial ships to navigate the warp, barely reaches into the dark half of the galaxy. Entire sectors have been cut off from reinforcement. The defenders are exhausted, undermanned, and fighting on more fronts than they can possibly manage. If there was ever a time when an orc warlord could actually achieve the impossible and unite the entire greenskin race under a single banner, this would be it. And if Ghazghkull succeeds, if the Great Green Crusade achieves its ultimate aim, the consequences would be extinction level for every other species in the galaxy. There is also a deeply unsettling connection between Ghazghkull and the Beast that some lore scholars have noted. Yet the Eldar Farseer, Eldrad Ulthran, one of the most powerful psykers in the galaxy, foresaw something like this happening as far back as the 32nd Millennium, shortly after the Beast was defeated. He warned his fellow Eldar that beasts never die, they are only banished, suggesting that the threat represented by the Beast was not a one-time event, but a recurring pattern in the history of the orc race. Some scholars have even speculated that Ghazghkull might be a reincarnation of the Beast itself, or at least a spiritual successor carrying the same psychic mantle. And there is another Eldar connection worth noting. In the late 41st Millennium, the Eldar of Ulthwé Craftworld took action to prevent a certain chain of events from unfolding, an action that, according to Imperial records, inadvertently raised Ghazghkull Thraka to prominence. The Eldar, yet with their obsessive attention to the threads of fate and the paths of the future, apparently saw something in Ghazghkull's destiny that concerned them enough to attempt to alter it, and their intervention, as so often happens with Eldar meddling, produced the exact opposite of the intended result. It is one of the great ironies of the setting that the most sophisticated and future-aware species in the galaxy may have accidentally created their own worst nightmare by trying to prevent it. Or whether this is literally true or merely metaphorical, the implication is the same. The green tide rises in cycles, each one larger and more devastating than the last, and Ghazghkull's cycle may be the one that finally breaks the dam. But let us also consider Ghazghkull as a character, separate from his role as an existential threat to the galaxy. Because there is something genuinely compelling about this orc, something that goes beyond the simple fear he inspires or the battles he wins. Ghazghkull, for all his brutality and alien nature, possesses qualities that are almost admirable. His loyalty to Makari, his respect for Yarrick, his capacity for long-term strategic thinking, his willingness to learn from defeat, his refusal to be confined by the limitations of his species. These are not the traits of a mindless savage. They are the traits of a visionary, an individual who sees beyond the immediate and grasps towards something larger. The novel Ghazghkull Thraka, Prophet of the Great Green Crusade, written by Nate Crowley, and told from the perspective of Makari the Grot, as he is interrogated by an inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, does an extraordinary job of exploring this complexity. Through Makari's eyes, we see Ghazghkull not as the Imperium sees him, a terrifying alien monster, but as the orcs see him, a figure of awe and reverence, a leader who gave their race something they never knew they needed: purpose, direction, a meaning beyond the next fight. Makari's account reveals a Ghazghkull who is capable of moments of startling depth, an orc who can feel regret, who can acknowledge when he has been wrong, who can show kindness to a grot in a galaxy that shows kindness to nothing. The relationship between Ghazghkull and Makari is, in its own strange way, one of the most touching partnerships in all of Warhammer 40,000. Makari has died multiple times, killed by Grotsnik, by accident, and by his own hand. And each time Ghazghkull has brought him back. The grot has served as banner-bearer, confidant, witness, and conscience to the greatest war boss in the galaxy, and their bond transcends the normal dynamics of orc society, where grots are treated as expendable servants at best and food at worst. The story of Makari's repeated deaths and resurrections is genuinely moving if you allow yourself to engage with it. When Grotsnik, jealous of the grot's influence on Ghazghkull, threw Makari into space from the World Killer during their flight from Urk, it was the first of many deaths. But Makari was reincarnated, as the novel tells us, waking up in a new body on Armageddon, with no memory of his previous life, until Ghazghkull found him again and gave him the claw mark that restored his identity. This cycle of death and rebirth gives Makari a strange, almost mystical quality, as though the grot is as much a part of Gork and Mork's plan as Ghazghkull himself. Grotsnik certainly seems to believe so. The Mad Pain Boy has admitted that he considers both himself and Makari to be part of the divine plan, instruments chosen by the gods to guide and support their prophet, even though Grotsnik personally thinks Gork and Mork are idiots. This creates one of the most entertaining dynamics in the lore, a triangle of relationships between the prophet who hears the voices of gods, the tiny grot who serves as his conscience and memory, and the deranged surgeon who created the whole situation and cannot decide whether he is proud of his work or horrified by it. When Ghazghkull was decapitated by Ragnar Blackmane, his last thoughts were of Makari. When Makari killed himself repeatedly to prove a point about being taken for granted, Ghazghkull eventually admitted he had been wrong. When a Lehman Russ battle tank blasted a hole in Ghazghkull's chest during their time back on Armageddon, it was Makari who saved him. Crawling inside the enemy tank and murdering the crew single-handedly. These are not the behaviors of a simple monster and his pet. They are the behaviors of a complex, contradictory individual who happens to be 8 feet tall, green, and carrying enough firepower to level a city block, and his equally complex companion who happens to be 3 feet tall and carrying a pointy stick. And then there is the rivalry with Yarrick, which is really the heart of Ghazghkull's story in many ways. Yarrick is the mirror that reflects Ghazghkull's true nature back at him. The Commissar is everything the war boss respects in an enemy: stubborn, brave, intelligent, and absolutely unwilling to give up no matter how overwhelming the odds. Ghazghkull himself has been recorded saying, in his crude but expressive manner, that Yarrick is the exception among humans, the one who knows how to fight. This is the highest compliment an orc can pay, and Ghazghkull pays it without reservation. Yarrick, but for his part, has been transformed by his obsession with Ghazghkull into something that is almost orcish himself. The Commissar's power claw, salvaged from an orc warlord, has become as iconic as any weapon in the setting. His bale eye, a piece of orc technology grafted to his face, glares with a light that the greenskins believe can kill with a look, and because they believe it, it effectively can. Their fear of it amplified by the psychic field into genuine debilitating terror. Yarrick has adopted the orc approach to warfare, leading from the front, relying on personal courage and force of personality to inspire his troops, and pursuing his enemy with a single-minded determination that would make a Goth proud. The two need each other, in a way that neither would ever admit. Ghazghkull needs Yarrick because a prophet without a nemesis is just a bully, and Yarrick needs Ghazghkull because a hero without a dragon to slay is just a soldier. And their rivalry elevates both of them, makes both of them more than they would be alone, and gives their respective stories a weight and a significance that transcends the individual battles they fight. It is, in its own brutal way, one of the great partnerships in the entire setting, a relationship built on mutual respect expressed through persistent attempts at mutual destruction. Ghazghkull's decision to release Yarrick after Golgotha was not an act of mercy or stupidity. It was an act of respect, the recognition that a great warrior deserves a great enemy, and that the story of Ghazghkull mag Uruk Thraka would be diminished without the presence of Sebastian Yarrick. This is what makes Ghazghkull's character so fascinating from a narrative perspective. He is not fighting to destroy. He is fighting to create. His vision of the Great Green is not a vision of annihilation for its own sake, but a vision of purpose realized, a galaxy in which every creature, orc and otherwise, exists in the state of perpetual struggle that he believes is the natural order of things. It is a terrible vision, make no mistake. From a human perspective, it is a nightmare beyond comprehension, a universe reduced to an eternal killing field. But from an orc perspective, it is paradise. It is everything the greenskin race was created to be, fulfilled on a galactic scale. So where does Ghazghkull's story go from here? The answer is that no one knows, not even the writers and designers who control his fate. The Great Green Crusade is ongoing, the largest orc force in 8,000 years, rampaging across the galaxy, with a resurrected prophet at its head. The Imperium is fractured and stretched thin, dealing with the aftermath of the Great Rift and the thousand-fold crises it has spawned. The forces that might have stopped Ghazghkull decades ago are now fighting for their survival on dozens of other fronts, and the war boss knows it. But what we do know is that Ghazghkull's ambitions have not diminished. If anything, his resurrection has made them larger. The prophet of Gork and Mork has cheated death itself, has been rebuilt in a form more powerful than any orc has worn since the time of the beast, and he carries with him the psychic weight of billions of believers. Every world he conquers adds more greenskins to his force. Every battle he wins amplifies the collective psychic field. Or every victory brings the Great Green one step closer to reality. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, if you listen very carefully, you can almost hear it. Not a sound, exactly, but a vibration, a tremor in the fabric of reality itself. The sound of 5 million warships carrying the combined fury of billions of orcs toward a destiny that could reshape the galaxy forever. The sound of the green tide rising, the sound of a prophet's vision becoming real. And that, dear listeners, is the story of Ghazghkull mag Uruk Thraka, the nameless goth boy from a doomed planet who became the most feared warlord in the galaxy. The orc who took a bolt round to the brain and woke up hearing the voices of gods. The prophet who turned a race of anarchic savages into a focused instrument of apocalyptic destruction. The beast of Armageddon, the warlord of warlords. The walking embodiment of everything that makes the orc race the most numerous and arguably the most dangerous species in the 41st millennium. His story is far from over. The Great Green Crusade thunders on, And wherever Ghazghkull turns his gleaming adamantium skull, worlds burn and empires tremble. He has been killed and come back. He has been defeated and learned from it. He has been underestimated by everyone who has ever opposed him. And he has made every single one of them pay for that mistake. Is he truly a prophet, blessed by Gork and Mork with a divine mission to remake the galaxy? Or is he the galaxy's greatest accident, a brain-damaged berserker whose delusions of grandeur happen to resonate with the collective psychic field of his entire species? In the end, perhaps it doesn't matter, because in a universe where belief shapes reality and faith has the power to move gods, yet there may be no meaningful difference between a true prophet and one who simply has enough believers. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka believes. His followers believe. And the galaxy is paying the price for that belief, one world at a time. There is one more thing worth mentioning before we close this chapter of the story. In the grim darkness of the far future, where every faction is defined by loss and decay and the slow, grinding erosion of hope, Ghazghkull and his orcs represent something unique. While they are, in their own terrible way, the only truly happy species in the galaxy. The Imperium is a crumbling edifice maintained by suffering and sacrifice. The Eldar are a dying race haunted by the ghost of their own excess. The Necrons have traded their souls for immortality and woken to find that the exchange was not worth the cost. The Tau are naive idealists stumbling toward a darkness they cannot see, and the forces of chaos offer power at the price of eternal damnation. But the orcs are having the time of their lives. Every battle is a celebration, every war is a holiday. Every skull cracked and every enemy routed is a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. And Ghazghkull's vision, his great green crusade, his dream of a galaxy engulfed in eternal war, is essentially a promise to extend that joy forever. To create a universe where the fighting never stops, where the enemy never runs out, and where Gork and Mork stride across the stars, throwing punches at anything that moves, and every orc, from the lowest boy to the mightiest war boss, lives in a state of permanent, violent ecstasy. It is a vision of paradise, rendered in green and splattered with red. And the fact that it is also a vision of absolute apocalypse for everyone else in the galaxy is, from the orc perspective, entirely beside the point. That tension is between the joyful savagery of the orcs and the existential horror they represent to everyone around them, is what makes Ghazghkull such a compelling character and such a perfect embodiment of everything that makes Warhammer 40,000 the richly textured, endlessly fascinating setting that it is. The story of Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka is far from finished. The Great Green Crusade rolls on. Worlds burn, empires crumble, and somewhere at the heart of it all, an orc with a shining metal skull and the voices of gods echoing in his brain marches forward, Makari at his side, Grotznik cackling in his wake, and the thunder of 5 million warships at his back. The galaxy has faced many threats. Hive fleets that can devour entire star systems, chaos incursions that corrupt worlds to their molecular level, Necron dynasties that ruled the stars before humanity learned to walk upright. Yes, but there is something uniquely primal about the threat that Ghazghkull represents. He does not want to consume the galaxy like the Tyranids. He does not want to corrupt it like chaos. He does not want to rule it in cold silence like the Necrons. He wants to fight it, all of it, forever. And the most terrifying part is that he just might be strong enough, cunning enough, and blessed enough to get exactly what he wants. Thank you so much for listening to this one. I know it was a long journey, and I appreciate every single one of you who stuck with me through the entire story of the greatest orc to ever walk the battlefields of the 41st Millennium. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of the most fearsome greenskin warlord the galaxy has ever known, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It really does help more than you know, and it means I can keep making content like this for all of you. Every like, every subscribe, every comment helps this channel grow and lets me dedicate even more time to crafting these deep, immersive explorations of the settings and characters we all love. If you have thoughts on Ghazghkull, on his rivalry with Yarick, on whether you think the Great Green Crusade will succeed, or on what character or topic you would like me to cover next, drop a comment below. I read every single one, and your suggestions genuinely shape the content of future videos. Do you want more Orc lore? More on the Armageddon Wars? A deep dive into Commissar Yarick's perspective on the same events? Let me know. The galaxy is vast, the stories are endless, and I am here to tell as many of them as I can. And as always, stay safe out there in the grim darkness. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember, in a universe where there is only war, the stories we tell about that war are what give it meaning. I will see you in the next one.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.